Should we reveal the secret now? Yeah, I guess. What are you talking about? Is it that secret you mentioned before we left? Yeah. You know, we've got some dead weight in our lives, right? So, I decided it's time to get rid of the unnecessary baggage. What? What are you talking about? Wait a minute. Well then, take care. Don't let anything hold you back, stay strong. My mom threw my bag out of the car window, and then the car with my parents drove away. I was born with a disability, and I use a wheelchair. Unable to do anything, all I could do was wait here for my grandma, who was supposed to come. 2 hours later, as it got dark, I was shrinking in fear. I think it was just the wind, but every rustle in the bushes sent an indescribable anxiety through me. After about another 30 minutes, a car arrived. Huh? Alone? What's going on? Grandma! Seeing my grandma getting out of the car, I burst into tears of relief. Despite being startled by my sudden crying, my grandma carefully helped me into the car, and we headed to my grandparents' house. In the car, I explained the situation to my grandma as best as I could. It seems like my mom and dad abandoned me. What? Leaving a child alone in the mountains? Can such a thing really happen? When I was left behind, I thought the same thing as my grandma. But it had really happened. But why would they do that? They said I was the dead weight in their lives, that they needed to get rid of the unnecessary baggage. No way! When we arrived at my grandparents' house, I explained the situation to my grandpa too. Of course, my grandpa was furious. My grandma started to get angry as well. However, when I mentioned a certain detail, both of their anger subsided, and their expressions returned to normal. My grandparents turned to each other and began to whisper quietly. There was something odd about my story. They explained it to me in a way that even a middle schooler like me could understand. After hearing it, I couldn't think of my parents as my parents anymore. So, the dead weight they were talking about was just an annoying extra that was tagging along for their own purposes. Maria, you're not dead weight at all. Don't worry. Let's see who the real baggage is, shall we? Will you help me prove it to them? Seeing my grandma's confident smile, I felt reassured. I hadn't heard what we were going to do yet, but I had already decided to help my grandma. I'm Maria. I'm a 7th grader, and I was born unable to move my legs, so I've always lived in a wheelchair. I have a neurological condition that prevents my brain from sending signals to my legs. Living in a wheelchair comes with its challenges. Even a small curb about 4 inches high, which my friends can easily step over, appears like a huge barrier to me. Because of this, I often don't want to leave the house. It's not that I have bad experiences outside, it's just that home is too comfortable. How about that? The front door is easier to open now, right? Yeah, thank you. Now most of the doors inside the house are sliding doors. It must be tough to push or pull doors in a wheelchair. Speaking of which, the handrails in the bathroom are getting old, huh? Maybe it's time to replace those too. I happily slid the new door back and forth, while my dad cleaned up his tools spread out on the floor. He runs a construction business and has made our home barrier-free. He didn't just change the doors to sliding ones that are easier for me to handle, but he also removed steps and placed light switches within easy reach from a wheelchair. This has made our home so comfortable that going out, which feels inconvenient, seems like a hassle. If there's anything else that's inconvenient or bothering you, don't hesitate to tell me. My dad often says. However, I know he has work too, so I try not to ask too much of him. I've never actually asked him to make a specific change. Instead, he just goes ahead and makes our home more accessible without my input. And every time he finishes a project, he says, "That's why I tell you to speak up if something's bothering you," and I get scolded. Each time, I feel his kindness. No matter how much he scolds me, I never ask him for anything. The reason is not just because I don't want to trouble him, there's another reason. We're poor because you're in a wheelchair and I can't go out to work, so don't keep saying you want this or that. My mother would often say, as if it were her catchphrase, we are poor. I remember she started saying this when I was in first grade. At the time, I was impressed by her frankness, even as a child. My dad does the work, but doors aren't free. Moreover, remodeling our home doesn't bring in any money. I realized this when I got to the upper grades of elementary school, and since then, I've been hesitant to ask my dad for any changes. But thanks to my dad taking the initiative, our home is comfortably equipped. Also, my mom being straightforward with her child about our finances is probably part of her way to ensure that I don't take things for granted. I believed that I was loved by my parents. But I was just a child who didn't understand anything. As I got older, I began to understand my parents' thoughts more clearly. I thought I was loved by my parents, but it seems that might not be the case. I'll load this side of the luggage. Please handle the other side. This is heavy, and it's always a hassle. I'm sorry. As we finished shopping at the mall and returned to the car, my mom put the purchases in the trunk, and my dad helped me into the car. To my parents, I am just another piece of luggage, like groceries or household supplies. When I'm in the car, I don't want to look at my own legs, so I gaze out the window instead. I wish I could argue that I am not just baggage, but I can't say anything since I only seem to cause trouble for my parents. At home, I'm treated as an obstacle by my parents. Hey, why are you in the hallway? It's narrow, isn't it? I was just trying to go to the bathroom. Bad timing. Haven't I told you always to check where we are and move so you don't get in the way? I'm sorry. You become an obstacle when you move, so I told you to just stay put at the edge of the living room. Really, you're such a hassle. A cardboard box that doesn't move on its own is better than you. Even though I said I was going to the bathroom, my mom moved me to the edge of the living room. If I move now, I'll be called a troublesome piece of luggage again, so I guess I'll have to hold off on going to the bathroom for a while. To distract myself, I watched a TV show I wasn't interested in with intensity. Understanding various things isn't always good. As I grew older in elementary school, I began to understand the real thoughts of my parents. The cold words from my parents hurt too much for a grade schooler like me. Every time I was treated like baggage by my parents, I felt pain in my heart. But a grade schooler can't live without relying on their parents. Gradually, I began to read my parents' moods and tried to be as unobtrusive as possible, like luggage that doesn't get in the way. Aren't you going out today either? No, I'll just watch TV at home. Good. It really helps when you stay home. I watched my parents leave for shopping from the entrance. They wouldn't return until after the night drama had finished airing. Not wanting to be thought of as bothersome luggage, I started to avoid going out with my parents and did a lot of house sitting. When I said I wouldn't go with them, my parents would smile. Seeing their smiles, I thought I was being helpful and smiled back. Looking back now, I think my feelings were quite messed up. At that time, not being bothersome luggage was everything to me, and I believed my parents' smiles were the result of my efforts. I was satisfied with the results of my efforts, but in the 6th grade, a trivial incident occurred, and all my efforts were reset. Maria, do you use a wheelchair at home too? Yes, but my dad has made our house accessible, so I don't need help from everyone like at school. I'm totally fine on my own when I'm home alone. With the grade change, I ended up in a class with students I hadn't been with before. Kids who had never been in the same class as me were very curious about my wheelchair, and during breaks, people would gather around me. This became a sort of regular occurrence after class changes, and I was used to it. However, what I said to my friends this time might not have been too good. Because of what I told my friends about staying home alone, the teacher contacted my home. Come on, a 6th grader can handle being home alone. Why does the school have to fuss about it? Right? Why did you even mention staying home alone? Now it's caused us trouble. I'm sorry. Apparently, the teacher had cautioned my parents that it's unsafe to leave a grade schooler home alone until late at night. Now, unable to be left home alone, I've become just another burden for my parents again. But instead of just not being able to stay home alone, my mom gave me a new directive. You need to go to an after-school facility. What's that? Mom showed me a brochure for the facility. The brochure features photos of children around my age, studying and diligently creating things. It seems to be for an after-school service that provides training to develop essential life skills and creates opportunities to interact with society. To be honest, it's expensive to send you to a facility, and it's hard on us. But you use a wheelchair, right? Dad and I can't always be there to help, so I want you to make friends here, receive training, and gain the skills you need to thrive in society when you go out into the world. If I were still in lower elementary school, I might think that my mom loved me. But now that I'm in 6th grade, I kind of understand her real motive. She just doesn't want to keep a burden like me at home. I understand. I'll attend this facility after school and on weekends too. I'm glad you understand. It really helps. Kids can understand and think about more things than adults might expect. I pretended not to notice my mom's true intentions. She believes her words sincerely and has a broad smile on her face, unaware of my act. Seeing her smile, I felt a happiness I shouldn't have felt. A year has passed since I started attending the facility, and my parents have been experiencing more good days. With me not being at home as much, they probably feel it's easier not having the nuisance of a burden around. Whatever the reason, being less of a burden to my parents, I started to feel that staying this way is better. But one day, my mom said something that meant things couldn't stay the same. You don't need to go to the facility anymore. What? You're a middle schooler now, right? I think you can handle being home alone without anyone complaining. Having attended the facility for a year, I've made friends. Initially, I started attending because my mother told me to, but at home, I felt treated like an unwanted burden, so now the facility has become one of my important places to be. Therefore, I'd like to continue attending if possible. I understand. I won't go to the facility anymore. But I couldn't oppose my mom, so I had to accept it obediently. With no more nanny, I ended up spending more time with my parents at home. Don't move from the corner of the room, you're in the way. Inevitably, I was treated more like an obstacle. Since I stopped going to the facility, I've been spending more time at home. I showed an unusual expression of dissatisfaction to my parents. Months later, perhaps touched by my expression, my mom finally offered me some pleasant words. Maria, why don't you and your dad go out together? Really? Where are we going? It'll be a surprise when we get there. Just being asked to go out by my parents felt like the happiest moment in my 13 years of life. As I was helped into the car by my mom, I felt the heavy weight of a bag on my lap. What's in this? Don't open it. That's part of the surprise when we get there. I'm sorry. I won't open it. It's okay. As I attempted to peek into the bag, my dad, sitting in the driver's seat, turned around quickly and stopped me with a loud voice. Startled by his sudden shout, I instinctively apologized. As the car started moving, I excitedly watched the passing scenery, wondering where we were going. After about an hour, I realized we were heading toward my maternal grandparents' house. I only see them about once a year and hadn't visited in the last 3 years, so my excitement grew even stronger. Their house is just over a mountain, and there's a rest area with only a convenience store in a large parking lot along the mountain road. Tired from driving, my dad stopped at the rest area, and I got out of the car. I went to buy a juice from the store. When I returned to the car, my parents were deep in conversation. My mom just called. She's running very late. Man, I want to get home early. Aren't we going to Grandma's house? Are we meeting here? Oh. Maria. You're back. Don't just start talking out of nowhere. You scared me. When I spoke to my parents, they momentarily looked shocked. But the next moment, their expressions turned serious, and they began to say something dreadful. Should we reveal the secret now? Yeah, I guess. What are you talking about? Is it that secret you mentioned before we left? Yeah. You know, we've got some dead weight in our lives, right? So, I decided it's time to get rid of the unnecessary baggage. What? What are you talking about? Confused and unable to grasp the situation, my parents hurriedly got back in the car and drove off, leaving me behind. Wait a minute! In disbelief, I chased after the car, though I knew I couldn't catch up. Hearing my panicked voice, the car stopped a little way ahead. Relieved, thinking it was all just a prank, I slowed my pace towards the car. As I got closer, my mom popped her head out the window and threw out some parting words. Well then, take care. Don't let anything hold you back, stay strong. She threw my bag out of the car window, and the car drove away. Left alone in the mountains, I stood frozen, unable to accept what had just happened. After a few minutes, I realized that standing there stunned wouldn't help, so I approached the bag my mom had thrown. I picked up the bag and checked inside. It was packed with clothes, and on top of everything, there was an envelope. I figured it was probably a letter, but I didn't have the courage to read any message from my parents at that moment. Looking at the clock at the rest area, I noticed it was already late afternoon and getting dark soon. I couldn't call for help since my smartphone was left in the car. Reluctantly, I decided to wait in front of the convenience store for my grandma to arrive. 2 hours later, it was dark, and I was huddled in fear. I thought it was just the wind, but every rustle in the bushes sent an indescribable anxiety rushing over me. The only comfort I had was the light from the vending machine. About 30 minutes later, a car pulled in. Maria, are you alone? I haven't heard back from Erica at all. What's going on? Grandma! Seeing my grandma get out of the car, I was overwhelmed with relief and tears started to flow. Despite being startled by my sudden tears, my grandma carefully helped me into the car, and we headed to my grandparents' house. On the way, I explained the situation to my grandma as best I could. It seems like my mom and dad abandoned me. What? Leave a child in the mountains? Can that even happen? I thought the same when my parents left me behind. But it had really happened. But why would they do that? They said I was the dead weight in their lives, that they needed to get rid of what's not needed. No way! That's right. There's a letter. I didn't have the courage to read it myself, so I handed the envelope to my grandma. She parked the car on the side of the road and checked the letter. What does it say? It's written politely that they can't afford to raise you anymore, and they want me to look after you until they can pick you up. Mason was supposed to be on a business trip for a few days, and Erica absolutely had to go with him, so they asked if I could take care of you for about 3 days. But it seems like they were planning to leave you with me permanently. What's with this letter? It was in the bag. I see. They couldn't say they wanted me to keep you permanently, so they made it so the letter would be found after leaving you with me. Not bringing you directly home avoids the hassle of opening the bag there, or having long conversations at home that make it hard to leave. I think my grandma's guess was right. After all, she is my mom's mother. She understands my mom very well. When we arrived at my grandparents' house, my grandma explained everything to my grandpa. Upon hearing it, my grandpa was furious. What kind of people are they? Maria, you don't have to go back. Stay here forever. I'm not letting them take you back. Seeing my grandpa's anger showed me what real affection is. It was totally different from when I misunderstood my parents' care. I had been watching my parents' moods, trying not to be a nuisance. Now I realized that was wrong, and I felt freed from my parents' spell. Today has been a day of too many revelations. Exhausted, I fell asleep without having dinner the night we arrived at my grandparents' house. The next evening, feeling a bit calmer, I opened up to my grandparents about my life with my parents.
I wasn't just called baggage yesterday. It wasn't the first time. How could they say such terrible things? And to tell you not to move from the corner of the room? What were they thinking?
The more I talked about my parents, the redder my grandparents' faces got. My grandpa, overwhelmed with anger, slammed the table and spilled his tea. I felt a strange happiness knowing my grandparents were angry at my parents. It was different from the feelings I had towards my parents, and I thought it was okay to feel this way. But then, as I mentioned something else, their anger subsided, and their faces returned to normal.
I was shocked when they told me I couldn't go to the facility anymore. I had been going there every day for about a year. What? A facility for a year?
It was kind of like an after-school program.
Yeah, I get that, but every day for a year?
Yes, I was going almost every day. What's wrong? My grandparents looked at each other and began whispering in low voices. There seemed to be something odd about my story. They explained it to me in a way that even a middle schooler could understand. After hearing it, I could no longer see my parents as parents.
So, the dead weight they talked about was just an annoying extra that was tagging along for their purposes.
Maria, you're not dead weight at all. Don't worry. Who's the real baggage here, huh? Will you help me show them? Seeing my grandma's confident smile, I felt reassured. I hadn't yet heard what we were going to do, but I had already decided to help my grandma. 3 weeks after I arrived at my grandparents' house, things finally settled down. Today, with my grandparents off from work, we were enjoying a relaxing time in the living room, sipping tea together. As I savored the tea, I thought about how nice it would be if this peaceful life could continue. Then, a disrupting voice came from the entrance. It was getting louder as it approached the living room.
Mom and Dad, what have you done?
My parents barged into the living room where we were sitting and started yelling. They were so angry that at times it was hard to understand what they were saying. Their faces were a mix of anger and panic, almost hysterical. My grandparents and I, understanding the situation well, remained calm and continued sipping our tea. Fueled by our lack of reaction, my mom yelled even louder.
We're in big trouble because of this. What are you going to do about it? Keep it down. We can hear you just fine.
My parents, not expecting me to call them out, were stunned, their eyes wide as they stared at me. Now free from my parents' control, I could say what I wanted. I was no longer the same person who had lived with them.
I've heard from Grandma what could happen to you, Mom and Dad.
Where are you in the process now?
It was you two after all. We got a call from the agency asking if Maria is still living with us. Then the lie was immediately exposed. It seems like nothing specific was said over the phone at that time. But this is definitely serious.
It sure is.
They're probably advancing the investigation on fraudulent benefits. Anyway, it would have come out eventually, even if we didn't say anything. How did you find out about the fraudulent benefits?
I know that fraudulently receiving benefits is wrong, but as a middle schooler, I don't fully grasp how bad it is. Despite it not being hot, my parents were sweating.
You remember when Mason came to us because his job wasn't going well, and he wanted to borrow money, right? You said it was because you didn't want to work and that you should work instead of being a stay-at-home mom, and I sent you away. That did happen, didn't it?
I thought my mom claimed we were poor to prevent me from being spoiled or demanding, as part of her way of educating me. But it turns out we were actually poor. My grandma had seen right through my parents' fraudulent activities.
How could you afford to send Maria to the facility every day when you have no money? That costs of after-school programs are expensive, right? Well, we wanted her to receive training to live independently in society. We stretched ourselves thin for Maria.
No, that's not it. You just wanted to offload Maria to the facility to make things easier for yourselves, right? But you stopped after about a year because you ran out of money, right?
Yes, we couldn't afford the facility anymore. What's the problem with that?
After Maria stopped attending the facility, you kept claiming she was attending to continue receiving the benefits for children with disabilities, didn't you? It seemed my grandma was right. My mom was speechless, struggling to find words. The fee for the facility I attended was indeed charged, as my grandma mentioned. That amount is what the users pay, and about 90% of it gets reimbursed through benefits. My parents had been claiming I was still attending the facility to receive these benefits. You thought Maria didn't need to stay home since you could still receive the benefits without her actually attending the facility, right? You figured that if you left her with us, you wouldn't have to take care of her and you'd still get the money. You've always taken the easy way out, haven't you?
So, you asked the agency to investigate us.
I didn't directly say to investigate, but I did take her to the local office and let them know that Maria, who is supposed to be living with her parents, is here with us. I asked if the benefits that should not be received unless living together were still being collected by you.
How could you know exactly what I was thinking?
How long do you think I've been a mother? A real mother understands what her child is thinking. Since you haven't really been a mother, it's no wonder you find it surprising. Hearing my grandma's words, I realized what real parenthood was. My mom was completely overwhelmed by just words and collapsed. However, my dad was still standing. It seemed my grandpa would take care of him. Both of you are dressed nicely today. Erica has an expensive-looking bag, and Mason, that watch looks pricey. Did you buy those with the money from the fraudulent benefits? No, I bought this with my own money. Really? Weren't you poor before you started committing fraud? So you had the means to buy such nice clothes. Maybe you were using Maria's disability welfare and special child support benefits as your own spending money?
I think this watch was bought recently. And the clothes, I may have stretched our budget to buy them.
Even as a middle schooler, I could tell their excuses were feeble. My grandpa looked at me and then gave a slight smile. It seemed he was leaving the final blow to me. Dad, you have lots of clothes with the same logo, right? And not just clothes, you also have many expensive sneakers, right? And Mom, your closet is full of clothes too, isn't it? Unable to escape, my dad also collapsed. This was why my mom had always said we were poor, as a part of her education. While they weren't exactly living in luxury, my parents did tend to buy things they liked quite freely. However, I never got the toys I wanted as a child, and there was a time when I threw a tantrum because I wanted one so badly. That's when my mom started saying we were poor, and I assumed it was just her way of teaching me not to be spoiled or too demanding. But in reality, my parents had been living off the benefits they received because of me. Essentially, they were able to live thanks to me being there. It turns out they were the real burden, not me.
Everything you're saying is true. We're the ones at fault. Maria, I'm so sorry for everything. From now on, I'm going to be a proper mother, so let's go home together.
My mom, now tearful and defeated, apologized to me. It seemed like she had a change of heart. If I were the same as before, I might have believed her and been deceived.
So, what now? You want to go to the agency together and claim everything is fine so they stop their investigation halfway through because it looks like we're a family again? That's your only chance now, isn't it? How can a middle schooler like you understand all this? I thought you'd just listen to us like you used to.
The truth is, I hadn't figured it out on my own. My grandma had warned me in advance that my parents would probably try to take me back at some point to make it look like we were living together for the agency's sake. It seems my grandma is indeed a step ahead as a mother. I've already told the agency everything, so going there together now would be too late, don't you think? And even if they want to hear from me again, I plan only to tell the truth.
Please help us. If you come with us, maybe we can still fix this. You're planning to abandon your own parents. You too, enough. Are you asking Maria to help you cover up fraudulent benefits? Yeah. You left Maria in the mountains, and now that you're in trouble, you want her to help? Don't you think that's asking for too much?
My grandparents were furious with my parents and tried to kick them out of the house. However, being younger, my parents weren't easily moved by my elderly grandparents. Being in a wheelchair, I couldn't physically support my grandparents, so I just backed them up with cold stares. When my parents caught my eye, they suddenly calmed down and left my grandparents' house. After my parents left, my grandparents and I made fresh tea and once again enjoyed a relaxed holiday. Later, my parents were arrested for fraudulently receiving benefits. Investigations also revealed they had fraudulently received grants. My father had been remodeling our home to make it more accessible, and it turns out he could get up to 2/3 of the costs covered by grants. He did the work himself, overcharged, and pocketed the difference. I had thought he was renovating to make life easier for me, but it was just pocket money for him. The total amount of money involved in the fraud was about $100,000. Committing such fraud is apparently considered embezzlement. If this money couldn't be returned, they were likely to go to prison. I don't fully understand how much $100,000 is, but for my moneyless parents, it seemed to be a significant amount. Somehow, they managed to gather the money and pay it back. But it was through loans. The situation of having to return $100,000 hasn't changed, they still owe that debt. Though they returned the money, they were still convicted. They won't go to prison yet as they received probation, but there's still a chance they might end up there. I thought people who go to prison are called criminals, but they are considered criminals because they were convicted, as my grandma explained. Being known as criminals, they couldn't regain trust, and my dad had to close his construction business. Later, they tried to find jobs, but the label of being criminals was heavier than they thought, and they couldn't find work. Now they are working part-time while paying off their debt. I've been legally adopted by my grandparents and am living with them now. We've also ensured that my benefits and grants no longer go to my parents. I don't know much about money, but I'm just happy to be living with my kind grandparents. I'm getting used to my new school. Now, I don't have to worry about pleasing my parents anymore, so I'm planning to live true to myself.